2011. She and her husband Yuri are members of Young Israel New Rochelle. We're thrilled to have you tonight. They have 5 little children. How you manage to do it all, I don't know. But we're thrilled to have you. Dana Fishkin.
Okay, everyone hear me? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It is such an honor to be here and to share some of my work with you. I just want to say a personal thank you to B'nai and to Ira, who's not here, but for sponsoring this lecture. I have such fond memories of B'nai's parents at my talks in Chicago at Congregation Or Torah, and I hope one day when I get to that place to be able to drag my husband to such lectures. He doesn't know that this will happen yet, so please don't share that with him. But at one point, hopefully we'll be able to go to such classes together and enjoy together too. So, so thank you so much. And okay, so let's get started. I feel that I have to start off with an apology because I gave this talk such a snazzy title, but I feel that I've misled you in 2 significant ways. The first way is that by entitling it Mikvah Stalkers and Shul Talkers, I think that some of you came here thinking that you would read lurid descriptions of people standing outside mikvahs and, you know, doing all kinds of weird things. Unfortunately, we don't have so many of them. There's a brief discussion, and we will cover that. So that's number 1, so I apologize for that. The second thing is that there really is no place that is medieval Italy. When I wrote medieval Italy in the title, what I meant was the Italian peninsula, but I'd already used so many words. And part of the problem, but also the beauty of studying this geographic unit is that it was completely broken up in the Middle Ages, and it stayed broken up well into the 19th century. So what I've brought here are some maps for you to see the different regions and the different ways in which Italy was, or the peninsula was broken up. I will use Italy, I'm sorry, it's anachronistic because it wasn't Italy, but whatever. So there are 3 basic regions in the period that we're looking at, which is the 13th and 14th centuries, and those 3 regions, away from this, are the northern areas, which consist of different cities, duchies, principalities, some of them belonging up north to what's called the Holy Roman Empire, some of them being free cities, free and independent cities. Then there's this middle purple area that you see here, and that's called the Papal States. That belongs to the Pope. And then you have this whole southern area, which is sometimes called the Kingdom of Naples or the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. It just depends on when in history we're talking about. But these 3 areas are very different. And so what makes the study of history in Italy, and especially Jewish history in Italy, so difficult is that you're really talking about independent geographic units, and each one is so different. Each one is ruled by a different type of ruler. It has a different composite of people that are living there. It might have different sets of invaders who came and settled at different times. So studying this peninsula, as I say, is at once a challenge, but it also makes it for a very exciting endeavor. So the 13th and 14th centuries are also a time period when there was intense strife between the Pope and between the Holy Roman Emperor. And so in addition to this fragmentation of the peninsula, you also have different cities and different areas leaning either to support the Pope or to support the Emperor. And what that caused are not only strife and anger, but also actual physical wars. So the 13th and 14th centuries are tumultuous time periods for anybody living on the ground in this peninsula, in central and northern Italy. It extended a little bit into southern Italy, but not as badly as it was in the center and in the north. Now, about Jews in Italy, we don't have many sources, and again, part of that comes from the fact that this country was, or these regions were so war-torn that we don't have that many documents or sources that come from this period. Also, one of the factors that we see in this peninsula, more than I would say anywhere else in Europe, is this mobility. Jews would pick up and move from place to place quite frequently. Sometimes they would leave their place of birth and go to live somewhere else in order to have access to better education or access to a larger Jewish community. Sometimes they would do the opposite. Sometimes they would leave their place of birth and go into another city so that they could get a job or that they could find work somewhere else. So we've got a lot of mobility around this peninsula, and you'll get a feeling for that when we talk a little bit more about the sources. Italy is known in the kind of mythological history of the Jews as being a conduit to Ashkenaz. It's mentioned as kind of this way station for Jews who lived once in Israel and then made their way to Italy. Some of them lived in southern Italy. Other ones lived in this city here of Lucca. And then as I say, the mythological story is that they emigrated from these places into France and Germany and started the communities of Ashkenaz. So there's that in the background as well. So tonight, what I want to talk about is a source that we have, a very rich source that we have from this period in Italy, but it's a literary source. And as a literary source, we have to be careful with it, but it also gives us tremendous amounts of information about what life was like and what kinds of concerns Jews had at this time in Italy. The work is what's called Machberet, or Machbarot Immanuel. Here's another, we'll go back to this in a second. The work's called Machbarot Immanuel, which is the compositions of Emmanuel. Emmanuel was known as Emmanuel ben Shlomo of Rome. He was a poet who wrote poetry in Hebrew and Italian. He may have been one of the earliest, if not the earliest, to import the sonnet form from Italian to Hebrew. And Emmanuel is an extremely prolific author. He wrote all sorts of different works. He wrote poetry, which was collected into this work called the Machbarot, and here you see the printed edition. He also wrote biblical commentaries. He claims to have commented on all the books of Tanakh, but unfortunately only 13 of those commentaries have survived. And there's also another work that he wrote on the mystical meaning of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet on the basis of the shapes and of the numerology of the numbers. So what we're going to focus on tonight is this poetic work, the Machbarot. And it is the format of the work. It's called a machberet, which is the Hebrew translation from the Arabic makama. This is a particular form that was imported by Spanish Jews, by Sephardic Jews from Arabic. And some of its typical features are stories about travels. You've always got the characters traveling somewhere. Either they're traveling within a certain set of cities, or they're traveling between countries. You usually have two constant interlocutors, two people that are going back and forth, and they're traveling together very often. And there's also this element of games and trickery, and this is what makes this literature fun. Where these characters are constantly playing games on each other. They're tricking each other. One just suddenly will appear, or one looks like one dresses up as some kind of unfortunate character to test his friend. So it's kind of this literature of entertainment through these games and tricks. And the actual format is called It's called Rhymed Prose. I brought you a page from the modern printed edition just so you can visualize what I'm talking about. So these lines here, this is all rhymed Hebrew, and it's prose, and it's interspersed with what's called the metrical poems. So these are poems that sometimes recap what the prose says, sometimes they don't, but they have meter, so they have a certain rhythm to them. So this is a particular form that Jews imported from Arabic literature in Spain, and it made its way over to Italy, where Emmanuel wrote an enormous amount of them. His book of Machbarot has 28 of these, and each Machberet is about, I would say, 1,000 to maybe 1,200 lines in Hebrew. So it's sorry, you'll have to excuse the book, but it looks horrible, but it's thick. So the Machberet that I want to talk about tonight is the final Machberet, the 28th Machberet. And it's called Machberet HaTofet VeHaEden, which means a tale of hell and Eden. And what it is a story about Emmanuel's journey through these realms of hell and heaven, and who he sees there, and how he interacts with them, both the people, the sinners in hell, and the blessed people in heaven. He's guided on this tour by a guide named Daniel, or Daniel, and this Machberet is very different than all the other Machbarot because it doesn't have this rhymed prose interspersed with metered poems. It's just rhymed prose, so there's no poems in it. There's also, it has the travel feature. It doesn't have the two consistent interlocutors that the other ones have, but it has this guide, Daniel, and there definitely are no games or trickery in hell or heaven. Sometimes when people ask me what I do, I say, I spend my life traveling through hell and heaven. I always get a good look for that. Okay, so this Machberet HaTofet VeHaEden is very, as I said, it's very different than the other works. First of all, it's the last work in the collection. It's also one of the most popular works in the collection because we have editions that are just this work alone, or just this work with another one of the Machbarot called Machberet HaPurim, which is all about fun and games at Purim. So those two seem to be the most popular of the collection. In this Machberet, other Machbarot have a certain attitude to them. Emmanuel likes to use, sometimes he ventures into the bawdy language or graphic imagery, but all of that is meant to entertain his readers. This Machberet doesn't have that. This is very much a kind of sobering reflection on sin and on merit and who belongs in which region, and you'll see when we jump into it. We can't discuss this work without mentioning the Divine Comedy of Dante. Dante's Divine Comedy was published, well, the Inferno was published in 1310. Emmanuel lives from about the from the 1260s to about the 1320s, and so he definitely knew of the Inferno, and there are some really interesting ways that he engages with this Christian piece of literature, which was written in Italian, and imports some of its ideas into his own journey through heaven and hell. Tofet VeHaEden is a very interesting text because in the past, scholars have always viewed it as like the little engine that couldn't. Whereas Dante gave this magisterial vision of hell and purgatory and heaven, there were all these imitators who somehow couldn't do it as well. These little imitators. There are a few of them in Hebrew. Emmanuel is the first one. And so what I've done in my doctoral work is try to steer the conversation away from that kind of model and instead look at how Emmanuel addresses certain problems in the Jewish community, certain intellectual trends that were going on around the time that he was writing this, and that even though he may be inspired by the Divine Comedy, he also has a little bit of a different agenda than just merely copying it for the Hebrew reading people. What I propose is that Tovet Ve'eden, this machberet, not only is one of entertainment, but it's also meant for edification. It's also meant to teach people, to improve people's behavior, to improve people's ideas, to kind of get them on the right track. Okay, so as I said, the machberet is framed as a guided tour of hell and heaven, meant to caution readers and remind them that an immoral life will result in severe punishment. Immanuel claims to have traveled extensively throughout central and northern Italy. And so we don't exactly know which communities he's referencing when he talks about these sinners and these saints. Sometimes he mentions their names, especially in heaven. He doesn't do that as much in hell. But what he does is he highlights different sins and what I call individual sins or communal sins. And he demonstrates that there is a connection between individuals who sin and also individuals who sin against the community. Right? So he puts them together in this very unique way where, first of all sin is regarded as offensive to God. Even the sins that would be considered ben adam lechavero, between two human beings. Those sins are also considered to be offenses against God. And in addition, he also posits this very unique view of sin as extremely corrosive to the community. So that's what we're going to look at tonight. Tophet, or hell, this region, contains 44 sinners. The first 12 sinners on the tour are guilty of what I call individual sins, which are sins that violate an individual's relationship with God. And these are sins that you would expect to see on such a tour. You've got gamblers, you have communal elders who shun true knowledge for foreign wisdom, you have female adulterers boiling in a bubbling cauldron, you have stingy brothers who don't want to give tzedakah to anybody, there's a heretic, there's an abusive son whose tongue is shredded for cursing his parents. Here he is. Okay, so the abusive son. He struck at his father, he spit in his face, he ran to him defiantly with his thickly embossed shield, he struck him once and twice until his father's groans ascended to the heavens. Right, so he says he and his comrades will not be remembered ever again. All this horrible stuff is going to happen to them, and he's kind of hanging by his tongue that's all shredded. And interestingly enough, the way that he describes here the sin is that this dishonored one forgot that, that due to the same father and mother whom he hit, he came out to the atmosphere of the earth. On account of cursing his father, they shredded his tongue. On account of hitting him, they mutilated his right hand, in order that his voice should not be heard anymore in the mountains of Israel, and on and on. So these are the types of sins, as I say, that one would expect to see sinners in hell guilty of. So in addition to these people, we have hypocrites who don't pray in private but demonstrate great piety in public on holidays. We have people who committed suicide, people who covet the material possessions of other people. So your typical kind of list of sinners. The next group are what I call the communal sinners. So for example, the sinners of this type are the people who misled the community in some way or affected its well-being in some way. This includes prominent men who choose ignorant men as chazanim, and that's what we have here. So you see these are 150 men that Immanuel sees they're kind of plunged into darkness, and they choose any man who is a drunkard and a glutton, he who profaned the sacred in the eyes of the Lord. He's a wicked man. He gloats about the lusts of his soul. When he raises his voice, he causes hinds to calve. One does not know whether he blesses or curses. So this is a chazan who clearly has not so many great attributes. And what Emmanuel says is just, they should be choosing somebody who's faithful to God, and yet they chose a man polluted and wicked, a veritable Gehazi the leper. And Bur, how is he fit to be a messenger of the public? So these kinds of sinners, where again, it's not about their personal sin, but it's about how the sin that they did somehow detracts from the health of the community. Other sinners of this type are learned scholars who use their erudition to gain pride and money. There's a bunch of elders consumed by lions and bears who also pray very piously and devotedly in public but never pray at home. And finally, we have the mikvah stalkers, men who stand outside the ritual bathhouses to jeer at the women entering and exiting. I promised you there would be some. But we're gonna come back to them in just a minute. And then finally, the last group of sinners. Where'd they go? Sorry. The last group of sinners are this interesting combination of individual sinners. So one would think by reading their descriptions that they would be part of this group of the individual sinners. Here we saw a bronze pot filled with tin and lead. Inside was a man imprisoned in fetters, an unclad wretch. Fire burned under the pot, an endless flame surrounded by fire and wood. In the pot was a deep and narrow pit filled with terrifying ice, and the angels of indignation and wrath would take him from the strange fire and bury him in the ice, and then from the ice they'd cast him back in the pot. So this poor guy is going back from ice to fire, from fire to ice, right? So what did he do? Well, he has strayed unfaithfully from God and committed adultery with another man's wife, which is why I mentioned that female adulterers are boiling in a cauldron. Because the male adulterer is here, and he is not being punished for this sin of adultery. If you see, it says he has sinned in, oh sorry, I have a fancy pointer here, I don't know why I'm using my finger, in that he taught his friend's wife to commit adultery with others and be infatuated with strangers, from whom she birthed bastard children, and her husband, not regarding these boys as sons, turned his eyes away from them and hid his face from rearing them, thus not teaching them wisdom and morals. And they, upon seeing that their protection departed from them, took hold of an evil path, and in their evil they melted. Once they schemed, and once they went astray, until at the end they killed and were killed. It was as though that adulterer had killed them all with his sword. So the sin of each rests upon him. Right, so here's an interesting example of a sinner whose sin one would expect would get him caught in the snares of the earlier parts of hell, where all the individual sinners were stuck. And yet it doesn't. It gets him into this whole different place where, once again, he's not being condemned for his sin of adultery, but he's being condemned for the fact that the community is suffering from these illegitimate children who are running around and wreaking havoc on the community. In addition to this sinner, there's another one who killed somebody. He killed a man, and because he killed a man, the wife and children were left to resort to a life of crime in order to support themselves. And so Emmanuel, again, does not condemn the man for murder. He condemns the man for this kind of nebulous host of sins that are all attached to this one particular murder. It's not only about that initial sin, it's about the rippling effect that that sin has on the community. And this is a very unique view of sin that we don't really see in other kinds of texts. So it's just a very curious and interesting point that for him, it's the sins are not necessarily only about the individual's actions, but also about the repercussions on the particular community. Now the question is why? What would bring Emmanuel to such a perspective? And what I suggest is that it has to do with his study of the Maimonidean corpus of materials. One of the interesting points that a scholar made is that when Rambam's works were introduced into medieval Europe, the Sephardic communities and the Ashkenazi communities were faster to accept or to acknowledge the halachic work, but not the philosophical one. And the Italians were much quicker to incorporate the philosophic works and less so the halachic works. Now, in the Guide to the Perplexed, Rambam talks very much about the health of the soul, the health of the body, the connection between the health of the soul and the health of the body. And part of what this health of the body is, in the guide, is the health of the community itself, and the kind of serenity of the community to allow people to work on their souls, on their intellects, on the acquisition of correct ideas, he calls it. And so it's curious that Immanuel would pick up this piece from the Rambam and demonstrate it in such a kind of real life way by looking at sins rather than keeping it in the realm of the theoretical. Here he actually draws out this kind of pool for us where, as I said, that individual sin will just bring down the health of the entire community. It's ironic that Immanuel would use Rambam, or a Rambamian scheme, in his vision of heaven and hell, because Rambam's view of the afterlife is so opposed to any sort of material place or material rewards and punishments. And that's exactly what Immanuel is describing here. So what I think we're seeing is this very creative attempt on the part of Immanuel to provide people with literary material that is at the same time entertaining, because who wants to read that when you die you are either close to God or you're far from God? That's not really very fun to read. You want to read about everyone in the different communities and the sins and what they're doing and how they're being punished. I mean, I'm sure there are some people that have thought about that occasionally. So he's very much concerned with creating a tale, with creating a literary piece that is entertaining to people and that is instructive to people at the same time. And so I think that by creating this particular sequence of the sinners, where first he tackles these sinners who sin on their own, and then he tackles the sinners who sin against the community, and then he offers us this beautiful hybrid view of how individual and communal sin are all wrapped up within each other, does he manage to pay homage to Rambam in this very subtle way, in this very anti-Rambamian text. So now back to the mikvah stalkers. If you look at the sheet, okay. So if you look at number 3, I give you both the Hebrew and the English of the Machberet HaTov Eden. And he tells us that he sees Anshei Chamasim, that is lawless men, Beraglei Susei Esh Nirmasim, that are trampled by the hooves of fiery horses. They are engulfed by anguish as water covers the sea. Right? And here he's saying, who are these men? Who are these men? He's asking his guide, and the guide says to him, these are the treacherous men who lurked near the entrances of the mikvaot, the houses of immersion, to see the women who, purifying themselves from their impure states, would come and go. Distracted by delusion, they are deluded, and each man neighs or calls after another's wife. They disgrace their mouths by inquiring of the women's states, and thus they gyrate in the pyre. Evil has infected them, as the pride of lust has adorned them. How many modest women avoided immersing because of them? their eyes spent with tears, their eyes raised to the heavens to inflict vengeance on them. They did not know, the fools, that they take someone's life in pawn, for there are those who refuse to immerse because of them and never merited immersing at all, and therefore God said to hasten them. Okay, so here we have an example of a group of people, of communal sinners, who stand outside the mikvaot, as it says, and wait to see who comes out. And not only are they waiting to see who goes in and out, but they're laughing at the women, they're calling at the women, and because of them, some of these women have stopped going to the mikvah. And what Emmanuel says here is how many modest women avoided immersing because of them, and so that some of them who were so pious didn't even end up immersing at all. They never merited immersing at all. So this is considered this great sin, and these men are being trampled by these fiery horses. Now this is a very poetic punishment for them, because one can say, you know, the men who prevent the women from immersing in the water are themselves consumed by these fiery horses, right? And all they would want themselves is some water, but they're never going to be able to get that. And so, seeing this, one starts to think about this question of, well, were there really men who were standing outside the mikvaot and staring at these women? Is something else going on here? This is a very curious passage, and like I said, to my knowledge, it's the only one of its kind. If we look at the first two sources, are other sources from Italy. The first is Rabbi Shaya Trani. Go back to the maps. So you see Trani is over here. Right, this is the bottom of the boot. Trani has an ancient history. It's actually this city here, Bari, that has an even older history as far as the Jewish community there. And once once there were problems for the Jews living here, many of them migrated to this close by city of Trani, where they lived in relative peace. Rabbi Shaya de Trani is also known as the Rid. If anyone here knows the Tshuvot HaRid, the Tosfot Rid, that's him. And this is a passage that one of his Tshuvot, one of his responsa, that he tells us about an interesting situation about the mikvah as well. So I give to you in Hebrew and in English, but we'll do the English. He says, regarding this subject, this is the second line, as Rav Hillel, may his righteous memory be for a blessing, wrote in his commentary on Sifra that drawing water for a ritual bath is a rabbinical as opposed to a biblical injunction, and this is the custom of all the communities of Romania. Nor is there a single community in which they immerse themselves in a ritual bath, save in the stench of the bathhouses, while at the same time they are menstruating. When I was among them, I learned that not one of the ladies took a ritual bath. A man from Crete, a scholar and a man of feeling, married a woman there, and got his wife into the habit of taking the required ritual bath. But the ladies of the community united against her, saying that this was not the custom. And because she was acting contrary to local practice, they acted toward her as did the ladies of Stone toward Lot's wife. And when I heard this, I became furious at them and rebuked them with shame and abuse exceedingly. They babbled against me that drawing water is only a rabbinical injunction, as Rav Hillel explained in his commentary on Sifra. Let it be known to them that they are in error and should not so sin. And I emphasized this until they accepted that this was actually a biblical injunction. Then they all gathered together in the central synagogue, and all the women too assembled in the courtyard of the synagogue, and the men and women agreed, under penalty of anathema, which is cherem, that they would not continue to practice such a wrong. And I was in other communities. They too were not willing to accept what I preached, nor could I prevent them. And this ban proliferated, but this sin was permitted in all the communities of Romania. Therefore, it is not right for any sage to dispute such matters, and all of the supporting evidence that you cited from the Talmud that supports such leniency, I will deal with these in a more extended fashion in a book, and prove that such evidence cannot support the contention that one can reject the principle of drawing water on the grounds that it is a rabbinical injunction. Okay, so what is going on here? First of all, what is Romania? Romania, there's a question about whether Romania refers to what's called the Byzantine communities of Greece and Macedonia. It could also be a reference to southern Italy, coming from the word Roman. So we're not really sure to which communities he's referring. And again, he comes from southern Italy, so it could very well be his home community. He does talk about traveling, so it's unclear. But what is the story that he's saying? He's saying that he got to this community in Romania, and he found that nobody was immersing in the mikvah properly. Right? Nobody was immersing in the mikvah at all, actually. And then he brought this story that a man, a scholar from Crete, came and married one of these women and actually taught his wife the proper method of immersing in a mikvah, and she went and did that. Only what happened to her? She was attacked by the women in the community who didn't want her to do this. They attacked her for actually following this law. And they said that, this is not the custom of the place. We don't do this here. And so there's this whole conversation about these drawing water and drawn water. And what that means is that there are debates in this period about what constitutes a mikvah, whether it has to be entirely from a natural source or whether one could add water that was drawn artificially or drawn artificially through some sort of pipe system to the mikvah itself. And what the women are saying here is that on the basis of this Rav Hillel, who wrote a commentary on Sifra, what they're saying is that drawing water is a rabbinical injunction, meaning it's not the worst thing if we violate a rabbinical injunction, meaning something, one of the rules that the rabbis set, rather than a biblical injunction. We don't want to violate, deoraita, but we can violate something that is derabanan. And so what Rabbi Shaya Dutrani sets himself to do is to correct this community and say to them, no, this is actually something that comes directly from the Bible, and at the beginning he's not able to convince them. Eventually he is able to convince them, but only them, and he continues on this path of traveling to different communities, and the other communities don't really listen to him. So what that means is that there were entire communities in this same century that were not observing the laws of mikvah and not immersing in a mikvah. In this particular society, there is a theory that because the Byzantine Jews would have been exposed to what's called like a bathhouse culture, that they were less inclined to immerse in a mikvah than, let's say, Jews that were not living in an environment of this kind of bathhouse culture or using the bathhouses. So, again, we have another example of people that are not using the mikvah, but why are they not using the mikvah? Because of some sort of erroneous understanding that these women had of a particular text, right? The women say, Rav Hillel said this, and so we do X, we do Y. The next text is the Shibbolei Haleket, another halachic work by Rav Tzidkiya Anav, also the 13th century, but in Rome. Now this text is an interesting one because it's a collection of other halachic opinions, and he says as much. It's not like originality is regarded very much in this text. And what Rav Tzidkiya Anav is quoting here, so this is his section on Hilchot Nida and Mikvah. The Shibbolei Haleket is, by the way, it's a halachic collection that covers, it's split up into 12 different sections. It covers the holidays, it covers Shabbat, it covers all this kind of, everything basically. And what he says, and I'll just paraphrase it for you because I don't have a translation here. So in that first paragraph, he talks about the passage of a woman from being a nidah to the period of libun, or the 7 days of purification. And what he says that a woman is in nidah until she immerses in a mikvah. But that after her menstrual period ends, what she does is she Poseket rochetzet bechamin v'soferet sheva nekiim. So when the period ends, she takes a bath in warm water and she counts 7 days, which are the days of purification, and then she can immerse in a mikvah. Okay, so what Rav Tzidkiah Anav has here is this little quotation, but what he doesn't have is a very large debate amongst different scholars about this warm bath in between the days of the period and the days of the purification. Because there's a source from Ashkenaz that claims to be from the students of Rashi, and it's preserved in a text called the Machzor Vitri, where the author writes about how these women take these baths in the middle, right? Because, and not only do they take baths after their periods end, but they change into beautiful clothing out of their gross clothing. And unfortunately, some of these women have stopped preparing properly for the mikvah because they just rely on those baths that they took 7 days before going to the mikvah as their mikvah preparation, and because of that, they're not engaging in a proper immersion because there's all these fears that things have gotten stuck to their skin or that they're really not fully immersing. Rav Tzidkiah Anav is already past that conversation. So whereas the student of Rashi, or so-called student of Rashi, says, blessed are the women who do not succumb to taking the warm bath and changing their clothes, and ashreihem and keep going. Rav Tzidkiah Anav kind of is beyond that. So it was just an interesting perspective to have. The next paragraph talks about women who don't immerse in the mikvah during the winter. And he says that if you don't want to immerse in the winter, it has to do, that's fine, but it's a kind of a discussion between the husband and the wife. Shelo kol hanashim shavot, that not all women are equal. Yesh isha sheba'ala yoter mechaveva. There are some women whose husbands like them better than others. Right? So for those women, obviously, you can't wait the entire winter to immerse in a mikvah, but for women whose husbands don't like them as much, it's perfectly acceptable to wait the entire season of the winter. And remember, we could be talking about Northern Italy and or Northern Europe in some of these cases where there's an extended winter, until they can immerse in a mikvah. But he says, "Ein ra'ui la'adam l'shanot ishto miminhag shchenoteha ke'ima ken bnoteha," meaning don't make your wife do something different than all the women in the town, right? That don't make her stray from the usual practice. And so that is the opinion that he quotes. And what I found interesting about that opinion is that what it suggests is that women were not regularly immersing themselves in a mikvah for a variety of reasons. For some women, it had to do with weather. For other women, it had to do with custom. For some other women, it had to do with the fact that their husbands were traveling, and so they felt no need to go to the mikvah, especially during these cold winter months, until their husbands would be back in town. And when we speak of medieval travelers, you're talking about months at a time, if not longer than that. But interestingly enough, especially this first source, and then the larger conversation around the second source, always seems to blame the women, and always seems to encourage the men not only to teach the women the right and proper practice, but also to encourage the women to go above and beyond the law to make sure that everything that they're doing is exactly right. And then we have Emmanuel of Rome, who says to us, these women are not immersing. And this is not news for us, because we know that women are not immersing. But what is the reason that he gives? Because there are men lurking outside the mikvaot. And this is fascinating to me. That this man, first of all, that this man, who really probably didn't have very much to do with this whole mikvah culture, takes this on as his own, he takes this on as a problem that he wants to expose. And I'm not saying that there weren't men lurking outside mikvaot. Maybe there were. But we know for sure that he is one of the singular voices, at least in the textual tradition, that does not blame the women for any sort of erroneous understanding of law or custom, or for following any sort of mistaken laws or customs. And I think that that's, you know, I think that that's a really interesting and different perspective than ones that we're used to. I just wanted to bring you on the last page. How much time do we have left? I don't remember when we started. 5 more minutes? Okay. So I just wanted to bring this to you because it's from a tshuva of that same Rabbi Shaya Ditrani, and it's from a tshuva on drawn water. This is his long tshuva about the mikvah and about whether you're allowed to use drawn water versus natural water for the mikvah. And he's responding to someone who talks about this Rabbi Isaac. It says, I wish to respond to your claim that it was improper for me to argue against the great Rabbi Isaac. This great Rabbi Isaac is the Ri, okay? The Rabbi Isaac ben Samuel of Dampierre, and he apparently said that drawn water could be used to a certain extent for a mikvah. And so Rabbi Shaya Ditrani says to this person that's asking, heaven forbid that I should do such a thing, meaning arguing against the Ri. It never entered my mind that I was arguing against him. I am but a single flea, okay, la la. Let's go down to the second paragraph there. The wisest of the philosophers was asked, we admit that our predecessors were wiser than we. At the same time, we criticize their comments, often rejecting them and claiming that the truth rests with us. How is this possible? The wise philosopher responded, who sees farther, a dwarf or a giant? Surely a giant, for his eyes are situated at a higher level than those of a dwarf. But if the dwarf is placed on the shoulders of the giant, who sees farther? Surely the dwarf. For now the eyes of the dwarf are situated at a higher level than those of the giant. So too, we are dwarves astride the shoulders of giants. We master their wisdom and move beyond it. Due to their wisdom, we grow wise and are able to say all that we say, but not because we are greater than they. So in this tshuva, in this response, what Rabbi Shaya is saying is not that, I'm not really criticizing, but I am criticizing. But the critique is framed in such a way that it doesn't suggest that the former rabbis were any less important or less knowledgeable than the current ones. Rather, it suggests that only through, it's this very respectful, kind of political or diplomatic answer. I'm not challenging him, but rather it is because of him that I can then move on beyond him to the next step or level. This image of the dwarf on the shoulder of the giant, it actually has many Christian sources at this period, and Rabbi Shaya Ditrani is the first Jewish mention, the first time that this gets translated into Hebrew and mentioned, and then it gets used over and over again throughout history. But I just thought it was such a beautiful image that it was worth sharing, even though it didn't have that much to do with mikvah stalkers. So, just to sum up, the situation in Italy is definitely still remains a very big question mark, but it's through these kinds of texts, both halachic and literary, that we can start to get an idea of what was going on in these centuries on the ground. And I think that, unfortunately, sometimes these sources are read separately because different people specialize in different fields. It's either history with, documentary sources, or literature with literary sources, or, Jewish studies with halachic sources. And really, the best approach is an approach that can combine all of them and put these sources in conversation with one another, because what they can offer you is a very interesting view or a window into a particular culture and time that otherwise you might not necessarily have so much access to. And if we ever hear of mikvah stalkers in the future, at least we can hope that, you know, there's some fiery horses waiting for them at some place and point in time. So thank you so much. Have a great evening. Sure. Absolutely. Any questions?
You mentioned the influence obviously came from Spain, from Sfarad, but how would, and you also mentioned the myth that Ashkenaz came up. I remember learning that. So what is the nature of this community? It's 100, 200 years before the expulsion, when we would get a lot of, like Sfaradim will come to Italy and Constantinople. So what is its relationship, I guess, to Ashkenaz, maybe is the way to ask?
Sure. So when we speak about halachic texts, most of the rabbis that will be the halachic voices in medieval Italy at this time have studied with Ashkenazic rabbis. So as I said at the beginning, you have a lot of mobility. Many of these, Rabbi Shaya Dutrani supposedly studied with Rav Simcha Shpayer. Rav Tzidkiah Anav may have been a student of Rav Victor Katz. So there is definitely a link between Ashkenaz and between the halachic texts of Italy at this time. Other than that, when we speak culturally, there is a general sense that these communities, because there are many of them, are very much entrenched in their local cities and towns. In fact, the city of Trani, for example, talks about Rabbi Shaya Dutrani in all the literature that it has and all the tourist literature that it has. It talks about this great rabbi that was there in the Jewish community. So I think that there is this kind of organic connection between the Jews of these various towns and cities throughout Italy and the local people there, which someone actually suggested to me is maybe another reason why we don't get so much information about them textually speaking, is that they were just so integrated into the society that they don't stick out as much as Jews in other sources do.
We have Italian Jews in our family. They do not consider themselves either Ashkenaz or Sephardi.
Correct.
They consider themselves Roman Jews.
Yep.
They have
That they predate the split between
different
Ashkenaz
types of
and
traditions and everything else. And I do not understand how you say they came up and made themselves to the Ashkenaz.
No, I didn't say that all of them did. I said that the Ashkenazi community, some of the Ashkenazi communities in Germany attribute their first settlers to immigrants from Italy, from Lucca, meaning some families left the town of Lucca and moved to Ashkenaz. That doesn't mean that all of Italian Jewry did that, not at all. Just that a particular group of families emigrated to Ashkenaz and began the community there, laid the foundations for the communities there.
Because not only that, the Ethiopian Jews, the Arab Jews, the Indian Jews, they all have their own community and they all have their own way of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not necessarily going to follow what anybody else says.
Correct. What you see in an example here from these Romanian or Romanio communities.
One last question, really.
Sure.
This poor guy is being pilfered because he had adultery with a woman. Now, no man can have adultery with a woman unless she said yes. Otherwise, it's rape. Otherwise, it's rape. Unless she says yes, and she should have been pilfered also.
Well, there are female adulterers, but they're, as I said, they appear in a different place. The reason that he appeared in the way that he did was because the author was trying to make a statement that his adultery was not limited to the sin of adultery, but rather that it reverberated well beyond his individual sin of adultery. So he does acknowledge that there are women adulterers In this particular case, he's not talking about the woman because that's not the point of the conversation. The point is that adultery leads to all these other horrible things.
Are there any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.